Somewhere in Washington, D.C., there is a building where people can legally create money out of nothing. And the country that owns that building has spent the last century using that power to run a tab that now exceeds $33 trillion. And somehow, the lights are still on. If any other country on Earth tried this, its currency would be in free fall, its markets would be burning, and the IMF would be on the next flight in. But the United States is not any other country. And the reason why tells you almost everything about how global power actually works. To understand this, forget what you learned about debt being bad. The way most people think about national debt, like a household maxing out its credit card, is one of the most misleading analogies in modern economics, and governments know it, and they keep using it anyway. Here is what is actually happening. After World War II, the world needed a new financial order. Europe was devastated, Asia was fragmented, and the United States had emerged with its factories intact, its military dominant, and roughly half of the world's gold reserves sitting in Fort Knox. So in 1944, at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 44 nations effectively agreed to let the US dollar become the backbone of the entire global financial system. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold. And just like that, the US became the world's reserve currency. Then in 1971, Nixon ended the dollar's link to gold entirely. A move so significant it should have been catastrophic, but wasn't. Because by that point, the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by something far more durable. The fact that oil was priced in dollars, that global trade was settled in dollars, and that US Treasury bonds had become the world's safest parking spot for national savings. The dollar was no longer a receipt for gold. It was the product itself. Now here is the mechanism that makes everything else possible. When the US government needs money it doesn't have, to fund wars, stimulus checks, infrastructure, anything, it doesn't just print cash. It issues Treasury bonds, essentially IOAs, which it sells to investors, foreign governments, central banks, and institutions all over the world. Japan alone holds over $1 trillion in US treasuries. China holds close to that. What this means is that every time the US runs a deficit, the world's biggest economies are lining up to finance it. Because holding US debt is considered safer than almost any alternative. You don't just trust the borrower here. You trust the entire architecture they built. But the Federal Reserve is the part people misunderstand most. The Fed can create new money digitally and use it to buy those treasury bonds, effectively funding government spending by expanding its own balance sheet. This is called quantitative easing, and between 2008 and 2022, the Fed's balance sheet grew from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion. They weren't printing paper bills. They were typing numbers into accounts. The distinction matters because the consequence isn't immediate inflation. It's something slower and more structural. It reshapes who holds risk, who benefits from asset price increases, and who gets quietly diluted. When you expand the money supply, every dollar that already exists buys slightly less, which is a tax that never appears on any ballot. The hidden math is this. The US can sustain enormous debt as long as interest rates stay manageable and the rest of the world keeps accepting dollars. For decades, that was a reasonable assumption. But between 2022 and 2023, the Fed raised interest rates at the fastest pace in 40 years to fight inflation. And suddenly, the US government found itself paying over $1 trillion a year just in interest on its existing debt, more than it spends on defense. That number is not a warning sign somewhere in the future. It is the present. Now widen the frame. Europe watched what the US did with quantitative easing and did its own version, with the European Central Bank buying bonds across member states in amounts that once would have been considered politically impossible. Japan has been running this experiment the longest. The Bank of Japan now owns more than half of all Japanese government bonds outstanding, a level of monetary intervention that has essentially made the central bank and the government the same balance sheet. China, meanwhile, has been methodically building alternatives, pushing the yuan in bilateral trade deals, establishing yuan-denominated oil contracts, building payment infrastructure across Asia and Africa that bypasses the dollar entirely. They are not trying to defeat the dollar this week. They are building the scaffolding to make it optional. The public explanation for all of this is that these are temporary, technical, necessary responses to economic crises. The structural reality is something else. The ability to print a reserve currency is the closest thing in modern finance to a superpower, and every other major power on Earth is watching, learning, and quietly working on their own version of the exit. The US debt is not a sign of failure. It is, in a strange way, a sign of how much trust the system has accumulated. Trust that took 80 years to build and that most economists believe would take a generation to unwind. The debt doesn't have to be paid back in any conventional sense. What has to be maintained is the belief that it could be. And that is where it gets uncomfortable. Because belief is not a balance sheet item. It cannot be audited. And no one in that building in Washington will ever admit that the most powerful financial instrument in human history is ultimately running on something closer to faith than math. So the next time someone tells you the national debt is going to bankrupt America, ask them a simpler question first. Bankrupted in whose currency?